Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome back, everyone. We're diving deep into the 1960s counterculture in America today.
Really fascinating period.
Yeah, it's like when you think about the 60s, what comes to mind?
Well, for many people, it's tie-dye, peace signs, and maybe Woodstock.
Right, exactly. But there's so much more to it than that.
Oh, absolutely. It was a period of radical social and political upheaval. Young people were challenging everything.
Everything, yeah. From social norms to the Vietnam War.
Exactly. And this deep dive, we're going to explore how it all unfolded, from its roots to its lasting impact.
And was it a success or failure? Guess we'll have to see.
Well, one thing that's often overlooked is that the 60s didn't just appear out of thin air. There's this really important connection to the Beat generation of the 1950s.
Okay, yeah, I've heard of the Beats, but how do they fit into all of this?
Well, think about it. The Beats were already rejecting conformity and materialism.
Kind of like the hippies, in a way.
Exactly. They were the precursors. They laid the groundwork for the counterculture.
So it wasn't just about the music and the fashion. There was a deeper philosophy at play.
Absolutely. A rejection of mainstream values, like take Jack Kerouac's On the Road, for example.
Ah, classic.
It celebrates this spontaneous adventure, right? A rejection of the 9-to-5 grind.
And Allen Ginsberg's Howl. That was pretty groundbreaking too, right?
Incredibly so. Challenged societal norms head-on with its raw exploration of sexuality and nonconformity.
So these beat ideas, they were already simmering in the 50s.
Exactly. And then in the 60s, a new generation came of age. They inherited this beat spirit of rebellion, but they amplified it.
Right. And the 60s generation had a lot to rebel against.
Oh, yeah, for sure. The Vietnam War, civil rights, you name it. Students were at the forefront of these movements.
It was a time of real activism.
And not just political activism, but a shift in lifestyles, too. Embracing alternative ways of living, pushing boundaries.
And that's where the hippies really come into focus.
You got it. They took those beat ideas about nonconformity and made them visible.
Yeah, the faded jeans, long hair, the whole look.
Right. But it was more than just appearances. Hippies embraced values like peace, harmony, communal living.
Rejecting that whole consumerist, individualistic mindset.
Exactly. They saw it as empty, meaningless.
So we've got the Beats, a new generation hungry for change, and the hippies emerging. Where did it all converge?
Well, there's one place that became synonymous with the hippie movement, Haight-Ashbury.
San Francisco, right?
The heart of it all, especially during the Summer of Love in 1967. Imagine thousands of young people flocking to this neighborhood.
Drawn to the music, the freedom.
The whole scene, free love, artistic expression, mind-expanding experiences. It earned the nickname Hashbury for a reason, you know.
Ashbury, huh? That's pretty telling.
Oh, yeah. It was a microcosm of the counterculture.
A real social experiment.
Exactly. And it wasn't just happening in Haight-Ashbury. Music festivals were becoming huge.
Oh, yeah. And when we talk about music festivals in the 60s, there's one that stands out. Woodstock.
Woodstock, the ultimate symbol of the 60s counterculture.
1969. Over 400,000 people.
Incredible. A massive gathering for peace, love, and music. Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, The Who. Just legendary.
What an experience that must have been.
A real testament to the power of music to
Right.
bring people together.
But there was also a darker side to the counterculture, right?
Yeah, we can't ignore that.
Yeah.
The pill and the rise of drug culture had a huge impact.
Things are changing rapidly.
The pill, for example, revolutionized sexual freedom, especially for women, gave them more control over their bodies, their lives.
A real turning point.
A major challenge to traditional values. And then there was LSD. Timothy Leary's famous phrase, turn on, tune in, drop out.
That pretty much sums up the psychedelic movement.
LSD had a profound impact. It led to psychedelic art, music, a whole new way of experiencing the world.
Think of the swirling colors, the experimental sounds.
Right. Reflections of the LSD experience.
Yeah.
But of course, there were casualties.
Hendrix, Joplin, both died from drug overdoses.
Sadly, yes. A stark reminder that this era of exploration had its risks.
It wasn't all peace and love, that's for sure.
No, it wasn't. And in fact, as the counterculture grew, a backlash began to emerge.
A clash of values, essentially.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But before we get into that, let's step back for a moment. What do you think were some of the long-term impacts of the counterculture? It's easy to focus on the music and fashion, but what about the deeper changes?
That's a great question. It's like, how did the counterculture change the fabric of American society?
Right. And we'll explore that further in our next segment. Stay tuned.
We'll be right back after a short break.
So where were we? Ah, yes, the counterculture's long-term impact. It's a big question.
Yeah, it really makes you think, like, how did this movement actually change things?
Well, one area where the counterculture had a really significant influence was on the environmental movement.
That's interesting. I hadn't really connected those two in my mind.
Yeah, well, the hippies, they were all about getting back to nature, rejecting that whole industrialized consumerist way of life.
Right, right. That makes sense. They were concerned about pollution preserving nature.
Exactly. And that concern really helped to pave the way for the modern environmental movement as we know it.
Like, did that lead to things like Earth Day and all that?
Well, think about it. Earth Day was first celebrated in 1970.
Well, wow, right after the peak of the counterculture.
Exactly. So you can definitely see the connection there. And it wasn't just the environment. The counterculture also had a big impact on feminism.
Yeah, the 60s were a huge turning point for women's rights.
Absolutely. The counterculture's emphasis on personal liberation, challenging those traditional norms, it really fueled the second wave of feminism.
Women were demanding equal rights, reproductive freedom.
Exactly. And the pill, which we talked about earlier, played a huge role in that, giving women more control over their bodies, their lives.
So it really was a time of upheaval, challenging those power structures.
Got it. And the counterculture provided this space for all sorts of social movements to gain momentum. It wasn't just about peace and love. It was about pushing for a more just and equitable society.
Challenging the status quo on multiple fronts.
Right. It was this diverse, complex tapestry of ideas and ideals. And yeah, there were definitely those strands of radical politics, anti-establishment sentiment, a real desire for fundamental change.
But there was also a growing backlash, right? Like, we were talking about Ronald Reagan earlier and how he criticized the counterculture.
Yeah, that backlash was significant. Conservatives saw the counterculture as this threat to traditional values.
Like a sign of moral decay.
Exactly. They focused on things like drug use, promiscuity, anti-war protests.
It's a real culture clash.
Yeah, those who embraced this vision of a more free, open society versus those who felt threatened by it.
So how did that clash actually play out? Like, did one side win?
Well, it wasn't quite that simple. It's more like the counterculture's influence. It kind of ebbed and flowed, leaving its mark even as it faced those setbacks.
So some of those ideas, they became more mainstream.
You see it everywhere. Environmentalism, organic food, yoga. But then other ideas were pushed back against.
So it's a mixed legacy.
Exactly. Some elements absorbed, others still debated.
Still relevant today, in a way.
Yeah, and that's what makes the counterculture so fascinating. It wasn't a neat and tidy movement. It was messy, contradictory, and ultimately transformative.
And its impact continues to be debated.
Right. But before we get too philosophical, let's circle back to something you mentioned earlier, about the counterculture's global reach. It wasn't just an American phenomenon.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It seemed like those ideas of peace, love, and challenging the status quo, they resonated with young people all over the world.
Absolutely. Remember those May 1968 protests in France we discussed?
Vaguely. Remind me.
Students and workers taking to the streets, demanding social and political change. It was a powerful example of how that countercultural spirit transcended national boundaries.
It's like a global awakening was happening, a sense that things could be different.
Exactly. And these movements weren't just about copying America. They had their own unique context, their own grievances.
But there was that shared feeling, a yearning for something more authentic, more just, more free.
It was about challenging those traditional power structures, fighting for a better future.
It's incredible to think about how those ideas could spread so quickly and inspire change on such a massive scale. But what about the long-term impact? Did the counterculture actually achieve its goals?
That's the big question, isn't it? And it's one that historians continue to debate, really. I mean, they didn't achieve all of their goals, like ending war, eradicating poverty, but they did leave this lasting mark.
So how do we measure that success or failure? Is it about specific achievements or more about a shift in consciousness?
It's both, I'd say. On the one hand, you have the tangible changes, like environmentalism, women's rights, greater acceptance of diversity. But on the other hand, you have those seeds that they planted, ideas about personal freedom, social justice, challenging the status quo, and those seeds are still growing today.
It's like even if they didn't achieve utopia, they helped us imagine a different future, gave us the tools to work towards it.
Exactly. It's a reminder that change is this long, winding road. The counterculture was a pivotal chapter in that journey, showing us that even the most radical ideas can have this profound and lasting impact. But we've covered a lot of ground today. What's resonated with you the most about the counterculture so far?
Yeah, it's really striking how this deep dive has peeled back the layers of the counterculture. It's so much more than just, tie-dye and music festivals.
It's multifaceted, for sure. You've got this really powerful interplay between idealism and the reality of how things played out. And yeah, that lasting impact is something historians are still trying to figure out.
What really stands out to me is how the counterculture challenged, well, pretty much everything, right? From how we dress to how we think about war, social justice, like nothing was off limits.
A true cultural earthquake. And like any earthquake, you keep feeling those aftershocks, even decades later.
You mentioned earlier that historians have different interpretations of the counterculture's legacy. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Like, what are some of those different perspectives?
Sure. So you've got at least four main schools of thought. One view is that the counterculture was this largely positive force, emphasizing its role in social progress, things like the environmental and feminist movements. This perspective really focuses on those ideals of peace, love, individual liberation.
Right, that's definitely a perspective I've come across. It's all about those utopian aspirations, right?
Right. But then there's this contrasting view, the one that emphasizes the negative consequences, like the excesses of the movement. They point to things like, drug addiction, the breakdown of traditional family structures, this idea of declining social order.
So it's like a rose-colored glasses view versus a more critical lens.
Yeah, exactly. And then you've got this third perspective. This one views the counterculture as a symptom of capitalist alienation. They'd argue that it was a reaction to the dehumanizing aspects of modern society, like this rebellion against consumerism, that conformity of the corporate world.
That's a really interesting take. So it's deeper than just rejecting certain policies or norms. It's this unease with how we live in the modern world.
Exactly. It's about that fundamental unease. And then finally, there's the perspective that focuses on the internal contradictions, how the counterculture ultimately failed to achieve some of its most radical goals. It acknowledges the energy, the idealism, but also points to that lack of clear leadership, and how easily some of it was co-opted by the mainstream.
A more nuanced view, seeing both the achievements and the shortcomings.
Right. It's this recognition that, yeah, they planted the seeds of change, but whether those seeds truly flourished is a question they wrestle with.
So I guess there's no easy answer to the question of success or failure. It's complex, a legacy with both positives and negatives.
And that complexity, that's what makes it so fascinating to study, to unpack. It challenges us to think critically about our own values, about society, about what social change really means.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I'm just struck by the audacity of it all. Young people daring to dream of a different world. A world without war, without poverty, without injustice.
And while they may not have reached utopia, that vision is still powerful. It reminds us that change is possible, that even the most entrenched systems can be challenged, that ordinary people can make a difference.
It's a powerful reminder that history isn't just these dry facts and dates. It's a living story, a story of dreams, struggles, aspirations.
And those dreams and struggles continue to shape us. The counterculture's legacy is everywhere. The music we listen to, the clothes we wear, the causes we fight for, even how we imagine the future.
So as we end our exploration of the 1960s counterculture, let's hold on to that spirit of questioning, that courage to challenge what we think we know, and that unwavering belief that a better world is possible.
Let's remember that history isn't just something we learn about, it's something we create. We all have the potential to be a part of that story of progress, to contribute to a more just, equitable, and sustainable world.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the 1960s counterculture. We hope it sparked some curiosity, challenged your assumptions, and given you a lot to think about. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.